I remember the morning light more than the moment I found out. It crept in slow and golden, pouring over the hardwood floor like it had nothing to hide. But the truth doesn't knock when it enters. It seeps in quiet and devastating. And that morning, it came for me. The kettle sang low, like an aching memory, steam curling into the pale light of our kitchen. It was a ritual I'd perfected over the years. Early rise, water boiling, the scent of roasted beans filling the air before the rest of the world woke up. My fingers traced the rim of the ceramic mug she bought in Lisbon, chipped now, worn around the edges, but still whole. Like us, I used to think. The farmhouse was quiet. Too quiet. Normally, by then, I'd hear the soft patter of her slippers, her hair still damp from the shower, trailing lavender. But not that morning. The silence felt loaded, like the air before storm. I checked the clock. 7:42. She was late. It's funny what you notice when something inside you already knows the truth, but isn't ready to say it aloud. The little things. The absence of her humming. The way her coat was missing from a hook. The pale indentation on her side of the bed that hadn't deepened overnight. She hadn't come home. I told myself a story, as I always did when life threatened the delicate scaffolding of normalcy. Maybe she'd stayed with her sister. Maybe a flat tire. Maybe she'd fallen asleep at the old bookstore she loved, the one tucked between the law firm she worked at and the pharmacy with the vintage sign. I texted once, then twice. No reply. The kettle clicked off. I poured 2 cups anyway. We'd built this house together. A modest place tucked on the edge of a valley in Vermont, where the trees turned to fire every October. There was something honest about the land. The kind of place where traditions mattered, Sunday dinners, fireplace stories, walking barefoot through dew-covered grass. We'd escaped the city years ago, running from layoffs and glass buildings, from endless commutes and the buzz of neon. She wanted quiet. I wanted roots. This land had been in my family for 3 generations. We were going to raise our children here, grow old here, let time settle into the floorboards like dust. But something had shifted, not all at once. No explosion, just a slow erosion. The kind that happens when love gets tired, when silence replaces laughter and schedules replace spontaneity. I didn't want to see it. I didn't want to believe the woman I married, the woman who once cried under the stars in my arms, telling me I made her feel safe in a world that spun too fast. I didn't want to believe she was capable of betrayal. But denial is a poor shield against evidence. Around 9:13 a.m., my phone buzzed. A number I didn't recognize. I let it ring out, heart hammering like it knew what I didn't. A minute later, a message arrived. No name, no pleasantries. Just this: you should know where your wife was last night. Attached was a photo. A grainy shot, dimly lit but unmistakable. Her face turned in laughter. Her hand resting on a man's chest. Not just touching, resting, as if it belonged there. I sat down, slow and trembling. I stared at the photo long enough for the coffee to go cold. The mug slipped from my hand and shattered on the tile. I didn't move. Her smile haunted me, not because she looked guilty, but because she didn't. And that was the beginning. Not of the affair that had begun long before this morning, I'd come to find. No, this was the beginning of me unraveling, of digging beneath the surface of a life I thought we shared and discovering rot beneath the floorboards. A story no one warns you about when you say I do. You think you know the person sleeping beside you. You think love is enough to anchor them. But people drift, even in quiet places, even in homes you build with your bare hands. I drove. I didn't know where. Somewhere between rage and disbelief, I ended up on a back road near the river. The one we used to walk along every Sunday before we got too busy, before she started staying late at the office, before I stopped asking why. The river was swollen, wild from spring thaw. A metaphor, maybe, or maybe I was just reaching for something to make sense of the ache in my chest. I wanted to scream, but I didn't. I just sat on the hood of the truck, letting the cold wind slap my face. The truth was, I wasn't ready to confront her. Not yet. Part of me still hoped it wasn't what it looked like, that there was a story behind that photo, a trick of the light, a misunderstanding. But hope, in moments like that, is just another way to delay the fall. When I finally returned to the house, she was there, standing in the kitchen like nothing had changed, wearing the cardigan I gave her last Christmas. Her eyes lit up when she saw me. Too easily, too rehearsed. "You're home early," she said, as if the night hadn't swallowed her whole. I looked at her for a long moment. A part of me cataloged the details, the way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the slight puffiness around her eyes, the smell of someone else's cologne that clung to her skin like a secret. I didn't speak. I couldn't. Not yet. I just nodded, moved past her, and stared out the window. And that silence, that knife-edge silence between us, that was the real beginning. You think you'll say something clever when the moment comes. You imagine the confrontation like a courtroom drama. Sharp words, raised voices, tears maybe. But when a moment actually arrives, it doesn't scream. It settles. Heavy. Cold. Like the first frost of winter across an orchard you never quite finished harvesting. That morning, I didn't confront her. I sat across from her in silence while she ate toast with orange marmalade, the kind only she liked. I watched her fingers, elegant, deliberate, spread sweetness across the bread as if her hands hadn't betrayed me in the dark hours of the night. She told me about her day like she always did. Plans for a new zoning appeal she was overseeing. A historic building the city wanted to demolish to make room for condos. "It's all politics and greed," she said, sighing. "The people in that neighborhood don't have a voice. Just dollar signs painted over their homes." And just like that, I remembered why I loved her. Or thought I did. She had always fought for the underdog. She once drove 4 hours to help an old client bury his dog. She stopped for every stray animal, every broken-winged bird, every person with a sad story and nowhere to go. And yet, somehow, she had torn me open without flinching. How do you reconcile that? How does the woman who rescues everything with a pulse become the one who crushes the heart of the man who would have taken a bullet for her? I didn't ask her where she'd been. Not that day. Instead, I watched her lie to me with her eyes wide open. That week was a blur. She fell into our routine like nothing had happened. Kissed me goodbye in the mornings, asked me if I wanted red wine or white with dinner. She texted me pictures of a stray cat that had wandered into her office courtyard. "He looks like trouble," she joked. I started sleeping in the guest room. Told her I had back pain. She accepted it too easily. Maybe part of her knew the dam had cracked. Maybe she was grateful I hadn't said anything. Or maybe she just didn't care enough to ask. I kept the photo on my phone. I looked at it when I was alone, sometimes in the truck, sometimes in the barn. I zoomed in on her face, her eyes, the angle of her fingers on his chest. I studied every pixel like it could explain the why. Was it about passion? Attention? Was I boring? Had I faded into the walls of her life like wallpaper she stopped noticing? It wasn't even the physical betrayal that gutted me. It was the intimacy of it, the way she looked at him, the way I hadn't seen her look at me in years. I started digging, not out of spite, out of survival. I needed to know. There's a point where not knowing becomes a slow bleed, and I was hemorrhaging hope. So I checked her laptop while she was in the shower. I scrolled through her call history, her texts. At first, there was nothing. But people leave crumbs. An unsaved number, she texted at odd hours. Short, coded messages. "Tomorrow still okay? You were amazing." I needed that. My stomach turned. I copied the number down, ran it through a contact finder. His name was Aaron, a real estate developer, mid-40s, slick smile, a regular at council meetings and zoning debates. I recognized the name. He was one of the men trying to bulldoze that same neighborhood she claimed to be defending. The irony stung. Not only was she sleeping with someone else, she was sleeping with the enemy. I didn't confront her that night either. I drove to the edge of that threatened neighborhood instead. A place called Marrow Hill. Nothing fancy, just old brick homes, a park that hadn't been renovated in years, a mom-and-pop bakery with hand-painted signs. I parked under a dying elm and watched people. A mother walked her toddler past boarded-up buildings. 2 teens skated in lazy circles down cracked sidewalks. An old man swept his stoop with the same kind of care I used to give her porch back home. This wasn't just a zoning battle. It was a war between people and profit, between roots and rent. I imagined her sitting in some boutique cafe with Aaron, sipping fair trade coffee and discussing gentrification like it was a game. I imagined him leaning in too close, telling her she was brilliant, that she was different from the others. And maybe, for a moment, she believed him. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the growing suspicion that she believed it herself. 3 nights later, I followed her. I didn't mean to, not at first. She said she was working late, and I believed her, or I pretended to. But something in me snapped when I heard the way her voice softened as she said it. I waited 10 minutes, then got in the truck. I didn't need to track her. I just knew. She wasn't at the office. She wasn't at her sister's. She was at his place. A new condo building on the edge of town. Cold and sterile, with glass balconies and concierge parking. The kind of place that didn't belong in our valley. The kind of place that promised luxury while bulldozing the past. I parked a block away and walked. I saw her through the window, lit from inside, framed like a portrait, laughing. Always the laughing. She looked free in a way I hadn't seen in years. Like she'd taken off a mask I didn't know she wore around me. And then he kissed her. It wasn't passionate. It was worse. It was tender. The kind of kiss you give someone when you know their soul. And I realized this wasn't an affair. It was a relationship. I drove home in silence. Didn't cry. Didn't scream. I just sat in the truck for 2 hours before walking inside. The walls of our house felt like strangers. Every photo, every knickknack we'd collected through the years, they stared back at me like ghosts. I slept in the guest room again, but I didn't sleep, because now the house had 2 shadows. Hers, and the absence of the man she really wanted to come home to. Some truths don't shout. They drip. Slow. Relentless. Like water through stone, wearing away the surface until all that remains is what's always been underneath. Raw. Exposed, undeniable. That Saturday morning, the air carried the scent of rain and rot. The kind of heavy damp that clings to your skin and refuses to let go. I sat at the edge of our porch, staring at the hills in the distance, trying to remember the first time she smiled at me. It had been summer. College. She wore a sundress and dirt-smudged sandals and carried a paperback novel like it was a weapon. Back then, she believed in stories. Happy endings. Justice. So did I. She came outside, wrapping her cardigan tighter around her, mug in hand. The same cardigan she'd worn the night I knew. The one that still held the scent of him, no matter how many times she'd washed it. Storm's coming, she said, her voice soft. I nodded, didn't look at her. Did you check the barn windows? The ones on the west side still leak when it pours. Still, I said nothing. She sat beside me. Our shoulders almost touched, but not quite. The space between us was louder than any words. I've been thinking, she said, about Marrow Hill, about how we might be able to delay the demolition order if we bring in the Environmental Protections Act. There's an old aquifer underneath the development site. If we file a preservation claim, does he know that? She paused, the mug in her hand stilled. Who? She asked, but her voice cracked like glass beneath a boot. Don't do that, I said. Not here. Not with me. I turned to look at her, really look. Her lips parted, but she didn't speak. Her eyes, green flecked with gold, eyes I used to think could stop time, searched mine for mercy. I didn't offer it. I know, I said. The silence that followed wasn't just awkward. It was nuclear. She set the mug down slowly, like she was afraid a sudden movement might shatter what was left of us. She opened her mouth, closed it again. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Ow! I shrugged. Does it matter? She closed her eyes. I didn't mean for it to happen. That line, like infidelity, is a pothole you trip into by accident. No one ever does, I said. And then I stood. I couldn't sit next to her anymore. Not when I could still picture her in his arms, her laugh echoing like a song I'd never get out of my head. I tried, she said. I tried, Daniel. I came home every night telling myself it would get better, that we could fix it, but you were always so distant. I turned to her, jaw clenched. Don't you dare make this about me. Her voice rose. I'm not blaming you. I'm trying to explain. We stopped talking. You disappeared into your routines, your tools, your truck, your damn silence. And I was lonely. I felt something break inside me. Not loudly, Not like a plate against the wall. Quieter. More final. Like the last breath before a body goes cold. We could have talked, I said. We could have gone to therapy. Fought. Screamed. Anything but this. I know, she whispered, and for the first time, I saw it in her eyes. Regret. Not the kind that saves a marriage. The kind that arrives too late to do anything but haunt the wreckage. That afternoon, I packed a bag. Just a small one. A weekend bag. A toothbrush, a few shirts, a copy of a novel I never finished. She watched me from the doorway, arms crossed, lips trembling. "Where are you going?" she asked. "Somewhere quiet. You can't just leave." I zipped the bag. "I'm not the one who left. I made a mistake." "No," I said. "You made a choice." Over and over again. She stepped toward me, reaching out. Her fingers brushed mine, and for a moment I let them. The familiar heat. The pull of 1,000 memories. But then I stepped back. "Don't," I said. She nodded, eyes brimming. I should have been satisfied. I wasn't. Pain doesn't offer closure. It just lives with you. I drove north, toward the cabin my father left me in his will. A place where cell signals died and silence was sacred. I watched the trees blur past, leafless and gnarled. I remembered coming here as a kid, before my mom got sick, before my father drank too much, before everything in life felt like something you had to hold onto with white knuckles or risk losing. I pulled into the gravel lot by dusk. The cabin was still there, still standing, though time had worn it like an old man's coat, frayed but proud. Inside, I lit a fire, the first one since the funeral. The crackle was a welcome sound, honest and raw. I sat on the worn leather chair and stared at the flames. And then I cried. Not because she cheated, not because she lied, but because the life I thought I'd built, the future I dreamed of, was gone. Like smoke curling into the rafters, disappearing before I could catch it. The next morning, she called. I didn't answer. She texted just once. "Please come home. We need to talk. I don't want to lose us." I stared at the screen, thumb hovering. But I didn't reply. Because sometimes, silence is the only truth you have left. Back in town, the developers had started moving faster. The Marrow Hill project was gaining ground. Permits rushed. Inspections bypassed. The community was fighting back, but they were losing. And suddenly, I realized something. Her affair wasn't just personal. It was political. It was a betrayal of everything she claimed to stand for. And that made it worse. So much worse. But here's the thing about pain. It doesn't just consume. It reveals. I started digging through the project files. I had friends on the township board. I knew how the system worked. And the more I uncovered, the more I realized there were secrets beneath the surface. Bribes. Falsified documents. Illegal zoning overrides. Aaron wasn't just building condos. He was burying bodies, figuratively, maybe literally. And she was either too blind to see it, or she was helping him do it. There's a moment, right before a fault line ruptures, where everything feels still. You don't hear the quake. You feel it. In the bones and the blood. A pressure mounting from below, deep and ancient. And once it starts, nothing stays the same. Not the ground. Not the sky. Not the man you were before. That's what I was living inside now. Not a marriage. Not grief. A reckoning. The cabin was my sanctuary, but it wasn't an escape. I wasn't hiding. I was planning. In the quiet hours between dawn and dusk, I pieced together the puzzle she thought I'd never see. Spreadsheets. Permit records. Land assessments filed under ghost corporations. Shell companies tied to Aaron's firm, slowly buying up property around Marrow Hill at below market rates, just after condemnation notices had gone out. It was systemic. Predatory. The same blueprint I'd seen in the city years ago, before we fled to the countryside to chase something more human. And now she was a part of it. Whether knowingly or not, I wasn't sure. But I needed to know. I went back into town the following Monday, just long enough to meet with Roger Davies, an old friend, once a stubborn journalist, now an environmental consultant with more tenacity than sense. I handed him what I had. He whistled low. "You plan to go public with this?" "I'm planning to find out if my wife is sleeping with a criminal," I said flat. Roger's eyes narrowed. "You sure you want the truth, Dan? Sometimes it's worse than the lie. Not knowing is worse." He didn't argue. The next time she texted, I answered. Just 4 words. We need to talk. She replied immediately. Tonight. Come home. I sat outside the house for 10 minutes before walking in. It looked the same, which somehow made it harder. The porch lights still flickered like always. The chimes still rattled gently from the wind. Inside, the walls smelled of cedar and rosemary, her scent, her rituals. The ghost of our life still walking the halls. She was waiting in the kitchen. No makeup, hair tied back. No performance this time. I didn't think you'd come, she said quietly. I looked at her, this woman I had once built dreams around. Then you don't know me. She gestured to the table. Do you want to sit? I'll stand. She nodded. Her hands twisted nervously in front of her. I owe you the truth. Yes, I said. You do. And so she told me. It started months ago. Late summer. Long hours at city council meetings. Heated debates over the future of Marrow Hill. Aaron had been persistent. Charming. He listened, she said, her voice cracking. He made me feel seen again. I saw you, I said bitterly. Not the way he did. There it was. The confession that stung more than anything else. She hadn't just fallen into someone else's bed. She'd fallen out of the vision we once shared. That invisible thread between us, built from inside jokes, Sunday rituals, and silent glances that meant everything, had frayed to the point of snapping. And I hadn't even noticed. She went on. It wasn't just physical. It was everything. He made me believe I still mattered. That I could be more than just someone's wife tucked away on a farm. I wanted to scream, to throw something. But all I said was, and what about the community? The people being forced out of their homes. She hesitated. That's not me. That's him. But you knew. I found out after it started. After I was in too deep. And by then, if I blew the whistle, I would have gone down too. And that mattered more than doing the right thing. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. I left again that night. No bag. No words. Just silence. That sharp, clean kind that cuts through everything. Back at the cabin, I threw a log into the fire and sat there in the dark. It wasn't just heartbreak anymore. It was moral fury. She'd betrayed our marriage. He'd betrayed our town. Together, they'd become part of the machine we ran from. The faceless capitalism that strips a place of its soul and sells it back at a markup. And I couldn't stay quiet. Over the next week, Roger and I pulled the strings tighter. We traced land sales, cross-referenced developer filings, and contacted residents being pushed out. We gathered testimonies, documents, bank statements, and then we went to the press. It exploded. A front-page story. A local scandal turned statewide controversy. The word corruption splashed in bold across morning headlines. Investigations were launched. Projects were halted. Erin's name was dragged through the mud. Subpoenas followed. And her face, hers, was there too. Not as a villain, but not as a victim either. She was a thread in the fabric. Frayed, tainted, exposed. She called me the next day. I didn't answer. She came to the cabin. Knocked. Waited. Knocked again. I let her stand there. Eventually, she left a note. I was wrong. I see it now. But I still love you. And if you ever find your way back to me, I'll be waiting. I stared at that paper for a long time. Folded it. Burned it. Because love isn't always enough. Sometimes it's not even real. Sometimes it's just the echo of who you used to be. I watched the valley that night. Rain started to fall. Slow, steady. Cleansing. The land would heal. The community would rebuild. Maybe in time I would too. But one thing was certain. There was no going back. The hardest part isn't the anger. It's not the betrayal, the lies, or even the loneliness that follows. It's waking up in the morning and realizing the life you lived for 10 years is now just a collection of echoes. And you're the only one still listening. It had been a month since the story broke. A month since I burned her letter and chose silence over salvage. In that time, the town had shifted in strange ways. Old alliances broke, new ones formed. Some of the residents called me a hero. Others called me a traitor. But I didn't want their praise. I wasn't proud. All I wanted was to stop feeling like a ghost in my own skin. The cabin became more than a place. It became a rhythm. I chopped wood in the mornings, ran along the mist-covered trails, cooked with ingredients that tasted like memory. Trout from the lake, eggs from a nearby farm, Tomatoes just starting to rot at the edges because I didn't always remember to eat them in time. And every night, I watch the fire. There's something brutally honest about flames. They don't pretend. They burn what's given. They illuminate what's hidden. And sometimes, they warm you just enough to keep going. I found myself thinking about my father again. He wasn't a good man. He drank too much, kept his love locked inside a cold, quiet anger. But toward the end, when cancer had stripped him down to something human, he told me something I've never forgotten. Forgiveness, he said, isn't about making peace with them. It's about not letting them rot you from the inside out. At the time, I thought he meant Mom. Now I know he meant himself. One day, I drove back to our house. Not to see her, just to say goodbye. She wasn't home. I didn't use my key. I stood out front, the gravel crunching beneath my boots, and looked at the windows like they were eyes. I imagined the life behind them. The birthdays, the burn marks on the kitchen counter from that Thanksgiving she tried to flambe pears and nearly set the drapes on fire. We laughed so hard that night we fell asleep on the floor. I missed that version of us. But that version was dead. I left a box on the porch, photos, letters, one of the mugs from Lisbon. Not out of spite, just release. And I walked away. Weeks passed, then months. The lawsuit against the developers grew teeth. Federal investigations, depositions. Aaron vanished, resigned, fled, buried beneath lawyers and NDAs. And she, her name, began to fade from the headlines. Eventually, I heard she resigned from the council, that she moved into a smaller place across town, still worked pro bono for environmental causes, still walked the ridge trails alone in the evenings. Some people said she changed. I didn't go looking to find out. But one morning, I saw her. I was in town, grabbing supplies, rope, nails, cedar planks for a shed I decided to build with no real need except the distraction. She was at the farmer's market, holding a basket of lemons, wearing that same cardigan, now patched at the sleeve. Our eyes met. There was no drama, no swelling music, just two people standing in the wreckage of what they used to mean. She didn't smile. Neither did I. We just looked, and then I turned away, not out of bitterness, out of peace. Some doors don't need to be slammed shut. They just stay closed. That night, I stood outside the cabin with a glass of rye and looked up at the stars. The sky out there has a way of reminding you how small you are, how temporary, how none of this, love, betrayal, even grief, belongs to you forever. It just passes through you, leaves its mark, and moves on. And maybe that's the mercy of it. I don't believe in neat endings anymore, but I do believe in rebuilding. Not the old life. That's gone. But a new one. One where I speak more, where I listen better, where I don't assume love is owed just because it once was given. The valley is changing. The people are healing. And so am I. Slowly. Honestly. Like the land after a fire. They say healing isn't a straight road. That it loops, winds, folds back in on itself. But for me, it wasn't a road at all. It was a field. Wide. Empty. Open in ways that frightened me at first, and then started to feel like freedom. 6 months had passed since the last time I saw her. Winter had come and gone, leaving the land scrubbed raw and honest. Snow melted off the eaves of the cabin in slow, steady drops. The kind of sound you don't notice until it's gone. The kind of sound that reminds you how quietly time moves on. I'd finished the shed. I built it from salvaged boards, mostly some from my grandfather's old barn, some from a collapsed neighbor's fence. Nothing perfect, nothing symmetrical, but it stood, sturdy, real, and every time I stepped inside it, I felt like I'd built something out of the wreckage that didn't need to be beautiful to matter. That in some ways was how I'd started to see myself. I wrote again, not love letters, not journal entries, just stories, little ones, fiction, things I made up to fill the space where the past used to hum like a power line. One story was about a man who lost his home in a storm and spent years walking until he found a place that didn't ask for anything but truth. Another was about a woman who planted flowers in the shape of her regrets and waited to see what bloomed. They weren't for anyone. I didn't share them, but they were mine. And I think that's what I'd been missing all along. One evening in early spring, I got a letter. Handwritten. No return address. But I knew the slant of her handwriting before I opened it. She wrote, "I'm not asking you to forgive me. I know what I did. I know what I broke, but I want you to know I'm trying. I'm rebuilding the parts of me I ignored for too long. The ones you try to hold on to when even I couldn't see them anymore. I loved you, Daniel, in all the realest ways. I still do, but I know that love isn't always enough. I hope you're okay. I hope you're breathing easier. And I hope the land is still good beneath your feet. I folded the letter, tucked it into a drawer. Didn't respond. Not because I was angry, because she had said all there was to say. And I believed her. But believing her didn't mean I had to go back. I kept seeing the town change. Bit by bit. Marrow Hill was saved, partially. The developers lost their permits. Investigations were still ongoing. People stayed in their homes. The bakery reopened with a new coat of paint. There was a mural on one of the brick walls now. Families holding hands, wildflowers growing between cracked sidewalks. I helped a little, quietly. Donated time, lumber, silence. Sometimes that's enough. One morning, I met someone. Not in the way I had before, not with sparks and grand gestures. She was a carpenter, worked at a community co-op downtown, built benches and birdhouses, and once rebuilt a greenhouse after a storm knocked it down. We didn't talk about the past. We talked about tools, about wood grain and warped nails and the satisfaction of sanding something down until it's smooth. And slowly, over coffee and paint-stained hands, something began to grow. Not fast, not loud, but true. She asked me once if I still believed in love. I said I wasn't sure. She smiled and said, "That's probably the best place to start." So here I am. Not who I was, not who I thought I'd be, but standing, living, and maybe in some quiet way, even loving again. The land still remembers. The cabin still creaks. The stars still whisper their old songs if you're still enough to listen. And I no longer need the life I lost to make meaning of the one I've found. Because sometimes redemption isn't a moment. It's 1,000 small choices stacked like firewood, built into something that keeps you warm when the wind returns.